So what I want to do now is read a couple passages from Negative Dialectics, and this is my translation of this. And for those of you who are not aware of some of the politics of translation here, Negative Dialectics, which in many ways is Theodore Adorno's greatest text, had a very unfortunate and flawed translation done in the early 1970s, and it was published, but there are a number of problems with that English translation. The very basic errors in terminology, the meaning was lost, the beauty of the original was largely lost, and English speakers who didn't know German had to sort of suffer through that translation till fairly recently. Back in 2001, I sat down and, in a fit of questionable sanity, decided to basically do my own version. And I'd studied German, I'd studied critical theory, and I figured the time had come to really do a somewhat better translation. And my version is not perfect, by the way. It has its own problems and limitations or whatnot. But at least I've got most of the terms correct and tried to get some of the meaning and some of the beauty of the sentence structures to come through a little better. And the passage I want to read is something that's actually very relevant to this whole question of the fading of the surplus, the crisis of empire, and the long-term rethink that I would argue Americans really need to start to go through, and that is to rethink their commitment to an empire which is not going to come back in our lifetimes. It's gone for good. The structures that created it are gone. There's no reason to cling to it, but people sort of cling to that because it did establish a certain baseline and provided certain things. And the passage I want to read is called Logic of Disassembly. And disassembly is my own idiosyncratic translation of a wonderful German term, Zerfall, which means disassembly, disintegration, but not disintegration in the sense of like totally destroying something. Zerfall means something sort of being taken apart, that you reduce it to its constituent pieces. It's not necessarily violent. It's more like a metallic object rusting and then falling into pieces. So there's some connotation of negation and nothingness, but it's not like annihilation. There's a trace or remainder left there. And it's interesting that Adorno plays with this notion of the trace, the remainder, that which is left behind by historical processes. So I'll just read the English version for now. In future webcasts, I'll delve into some of the original German, but for now, just the English. The farewell to Hegel becomes palpable in a contradiction concerning the whole, which is not programmatically settled as a particular one. The critic of the Kantian separation of form and content, Hegel wanted a philosophy without a detachable form, without a method implemented independently from the thing and yet proceeded methodically. In fact, the dialectic is neither solely a method nor something real in the naive understanding of the term. Not a method for the unreconciled thing which lacks precisely that identity which the thought surrogates, is contradictory and blocks every attempt at unanimous interpretation. This thing, not the organizational drive of thought, is the impetus to dialectics. Not something simply real, for contradictoriness is a reflection category, the thinking confrontation of concept and thing. Dialectics as a procedure means to think for the sake of what was once experienced in the thing as a contradiction and against it in contradictions. Very complicated thought, very subtle, sophisticated thought, and this is very typical of Adorno, that he'll start with this certain claim, and then he'll go to Kant, he'll go to Hegel, and he'll go to the world system, and it's almost breathtaking the degree to which he's really thinking these very large patterns. He's thinking in terms of centuries. This is something that a critic once wrote about Georgi Lukács, and complaining basically he couldn't really understand what Lukács was writing because Lukács is thinking in centuries, and my goodness, like us poor mortals can only think day to day, which is true and not true. A little work though, and it is possible to sort of unpack what Adorno is saying and doing here. And one thing that I do want to stress is that for all the complexity of what Adorno's talking about, it's still possible to understand. You can understand it, but you you need to think for a second about history, about politics, and a little bit about your own location or our own location in history, whatever that is. And then think about how these categories matter. So let's back up and go to the beginning here. So the very first sentence. The farewell to Hegel becomes palpable and a contradiction concerning the whole, which is not programmatically settled as a particular one. And a little backdrop there. A farewell to Hegel. Adorno is the last one to say goodbye to writers in the American sense of bye, done, gone. Okay, no, things don't go away like that. The farewell to Hegel means there's certain thematic themes that Hegel is dealing with that are not relevant in the same way, and there's certain thought structures that he creates that are no longer adequate to our time. But first we have to think about what Hegel did create, which Adorno finds useful and important for our time. So it's the contradiction concerning this issue of the whole, the totality, the system of all systems that I mentioned previously, or the system that's even larger than, say, the American Empire. And it's not programmatically settled as a particular one. Okay? The critic of the Kantian separation of form and content, Hegel wanted philosophy without a detachable form, without a method implemented independently from the thing, and yet proceeded methodically. So there's a big contradiction here. And this is true of the Hegelian system. The Hegelian system styles itself. It wants to be a system of systems. It wants to be the all-purposive, all-knowing of all things, of all contradiction. It wants to be sort of the world system that it's trying to diagnose. And that's why, of course, we call it idealism, because, of course, it can't be that. It's just a thought structure, and it can't match the actual real contradictions of society out there. No matter how good your thought structure, there are other people thinking, and they have their own thoughts, and they may disagree with your thoughts. And Hegel's system doesn't give us a way of thinking about that contradiction. He has a wonderful speculative energy and drive, but the notion of a democracy of the concept, the concepts would have to earn their citizenship, as it were, in a dialogue and debate with others. He doesn't get that. He's not concerned with that, doesn't have a concept for that. In fact, says Adorno, the dialectic is neither solely a method nor something real in the naive understanding of the term. It's not a method for the unreconciled thing which lacks precisely that identity which the thought surrogates. And again, he's using identity in a very complex way. Thing. What is this thing? And by this, Adorno is doing something very subtle and interesting. He wants us to think about the everyday experiences of the consumer culture. Think of something that you really, really want, a consumer good that you really want and desire. It could be some fancy new technology, some new tech toy or whatnot. And then stop for a second and think of it as a thing. A thing. How is that object a thing? What is its thingness? What is it about it that's so important that you think that you really want? And if you stop and think about this, then it starts to be, well, why do I want this so much? Why do I want this latest such and such? Why do I want this or that? That becomes a moment of self-criticism. So thing is any kind of consumable object in a consumer culture. Okay, so to put it into context here. This thing, not the organizational drive of thought, is the impetus to dialectics. Not something simply real, for contradictoriness is a reflection category. The thinking confrontation of concept and thing. So there's a second layer here. First of these things, objects all around us that we have to deal with. Then there are these concepts. And so Adorno is setting both in motion at the same time. It's not just about the thingness of things. It's also about the conceptuality of the concepts. That's also a set of contradictions. So you have two sets of contradictions moving at the same time on radically different levels. The local level of personal experience and the conceptual level, which is a much larger system of system level. So you have the local tension and the global tension in the same frame. Adorno wants you to think of all these things together. Not as a flat unity, not as a flat field where all the nails get hammered down into a single concept, no, but as a field of contradictions, where there's contestation and struggle happening. So go a little further. Dialectics as a procedure means to think for the sake of what was once experienced in the thing as a contradiction and against it in contradictions. So what was experienced in whatever kind of commodity, whether it was the production of that commodity, its distribution, its consumption, its reception, its memorialization, or whatever else happens, and then against it in terms of the contradictions of all those spaces. A contradiction in reality, writes Adorno, it is a contradiction against these. And think of the language play here. And I've tried to translate this into reasonably good and literate English, but a lot of the wordplay here. And Adorno's playing with pronouns. He does this a lot. He's very acutely aware of the politics of language, the way that language can name contradictions and create these little zingers of thoughts. Very complex, because what he's doing here is it is a contradiction against these. So we've gone from the single reality, and then he kind of springs this surprise on us that it's a contradiction against these. It's a contradiction against all of this, against this entire field of contradictions. So we're talking a field of contradictions against another field of contradictions. So this is very sophisticated, high-level sort of thought. And your response might be, okay, well, what does that mean? Isn't that very abstract and Hegelian? And actually, no, there's something very concrete about this. He's going to reel this in, this very speculation of a speculation, back into something very, very concrete. Such a dialectics is, however, no longer compatible with Hegel. Its movement does not tend towards identity and the difference of every object from its concept. Rather, it suspects something identical in it.